He wasn't just the father of country music. He was its ghost. Hank Williams Sr. lived fast, wrote hard, and died young. But what if the story we've been told about his death isn't the full truth? What if something, or someone, wanted him gone? It was New Year's Day, 1953, when the 29-year-old legend was found dead in the back seat of a powder blue Cadillac. The official story blamed heart failure brought on by years of alcohol and drug abuse. But nearly everything about that final ride, from the mysterious driver to the missing hospital records, has never added up. Why was a man that sick put on the road in the middle of the night? Who gave him the final injection? And what did his handlers have to gain from his death? For decades, the mystery surrounding Hank's final hours has remained buried beneath fame, folklore, and fading memories. But now, after years of silence, new evidence has come to light, revealing a web of exploitation, betrayal, and a truth far darker than anyone expected. This is the story of Hank Williams Sr. and the chilling mystery behind his death that's finally been solved. He was born Hiram King Williams on September 17, 1923, in the small town of Mount Olive, Alabama. From the moment he could walk, Hank Sr. was surrounded by music. His mother played the organ at church, and by age 8, he had built a guitar from a cigar box and some strings. But this wasn't the story of a boy nurtured by a loving home. His father was institutionalized when Hank was just 6 years old, and the family fell into poverty. Hank became the man of the house before he ever became a teenager. The world around him was tough, and the emotional scars of abandonment and struggle would never fully heal. By the time he was in his late teens, Hank was already drinking heavily, partly to cope with the pain of a congenital spinal disorder, spina bifida occulta, that caused lifelong back problems. The physical pain was real, but so was the emotional weight of being pushed too fast, too young into stardom. After performing on local radio shows and making a name for himself in Montgomery, Hank eventually caught the attention of music executives in Nashville. But what they saw wasn't a fragile young man in pain. They saw a marketable figure, a product, a paycheck. In 1947, Hank recorded Move It On Over, a song that marked the beginning of something massive. 2 years later, he released Lovesick Blues, which skyrocketed him into superstardom and earned him a spot on the Grand Ole Opry. He was only 25 years old, but already burdened with the pressures of fame, failing health, and an industry that valued his songs more than his soul. The hits kept coming. Your Cheatin Heart, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, Cold, Cold Heart. His music was soaked in sorrow, drawn from his personal battles with addiction, heartbreak, and chronic illness. He poured his pain into his lyrics, creating some of the most emotionally raw songs the country genre had ever heard. Fans loved it. Industry execs loved it. But behind the scenes, Hank was deteriorating fast. The drinking worsened. He began using painkillers, morphine, and chloral hydrate to manage the agony in his back and the torment in his mind. His performances became erratic. He was fired from the Grand Ole Opry in 1952, less than 3 years after becoming its brightest star. Divorce papers with his first wife, Audrey, were finalized. And the people who were supposed to protect him, his doctors, his friends, his managers, only seemed to enable him, sometimes even encouraging him to stay on the road, keep performing, and keep making money, no matter the cost. By late 1952, Hank Williams Sr. was a legend, but also a liability. And as we begin to unpack what really happened on that final ride to Canton, Ohio, the cracks in the official narrative begin to show. Because for a man surrounded by handlers, physicians, and promoters, the question isn't just how he died, but who stood to gain when he finally did. The official story goes like this. In the early hours of January 1st, 1953, Hank Williams Sr. was being driven from Knoxville, Tennessee, to a concert in Canton, Ohio by a college student named Charles Carr. Hank had been too weak and ill to fly, and the weather was treacherous. So they opted for a long drive in a powder blue Cadillac. Somewhere between Tennessee and West Virginia, Hank allegedly passed away in the back seat. When Carr tried to wake him at a gas station stop in Oak Hill, West Virginia, Hank was unresponsive. A local doctor was called. He was pronounced dead. The cause, heart failure, officially. But the truth, as it turns out, might be far darker. First, consider the timeline. Carr claimed Hank had been alive when they left Knoxville, but many believe he was already in critical condition, if not already dead, by the time the car hit the highway. Multiple gas station attendants and hotel staff along the route gave conflicting statements about whether Hank was asleep, drunk, sick, or dead. Some said they never saw him move. Others said he was slumped strangely in the back seat. Still others claimed Carr looked panicked, but was told to keep going. If Hank was already unconscious, or worse, why wasn't medical help called sooner? And then there's the matter of the mysterious injection. Reports from the Knoxville hotel where they stopped on New Year's Eve mention a doctor giving Hank a shot, likely of morphine and vitamin B12, to ease his pain and calm his tremors. The doctor wasn't licensed to practice medicine. The substances used weren't monitored. Some believe this so-called health booster was the final nail in Hank's coffin. That lethal cocktail, combined with his frail body and long-term alcohol abuse, may have been enough to kill him slowly over the course of the drive. The driver, Charles Carr, was just a teenager, barely 17. And yet, when faced with the death of a musical icon in the back seat, he didn't immediately call the police. He didn't stop the car. He drove for hours. Why? Was he under orders? Was he told not to contact authorities until the body was in a different jurisdiction? Some say the route was intentionally mapped to avoid stopping in areas where questions might arise. And who paid for Carr to make that drive in the first place? Promoters? Managers? Someone who didn't want Hank to cancel yet another show? There's also the curious silence of the people who profited most from Hank's endless touring, his record label, concert promoters, and handlers. Hank Williams was a cash cow, even in poor health. His suffering didn't matter to them so long as tickets were sold. Did someone in that circle know how bad things had gotten? Did they push him to keep performing, even as his body was shutting down? And then, most disturbingly, there are rumors, whispers passed down for decades, that the people around Hank knew he wouldn't make it through that trip, that the injection was a gamble, that keeping him on the road was a risk they took knowingly, that a dead Hank Williams would be just as profitable, if not more so, than a live one. In the end, we're left with a young man's body growing cold in the back seat of a car. A teenage driver given almost no guidance, and a death certificate that raises more questions than it answers. Something wasn't right. Something was hidden. And as we dig deeper, the mystery of Hank Williams's death begins to look a lot less like tragedy and more like convenience. Behind the myth of Hank Williams Sr. lies a maze of contradictions, betrayals, and decisions made not by a tortured genius, but by those who profited off his pain. To understand how his death became shrouded in mystery, you first have to understand the people who surrounded him during his final years. Managers, doctors, lovers, and even family. Many of them claimed to love him, but their actions told a different story. Hank wasn't just a man anymore. He was a product, a commodity. And by the early 1950s, the race to control that commodity was becoming increasingly cutthroat. Take Audrey Williams, Hank's first wife, and the mother of Hank Williams Jr. Their marriage was passionate, volatile, and marked by constant fights and infidelity on both sides. Audrey had ambitions of her own. She saw herself as a country star and often demanded to sing duets with Hank, even though many producers and musicians said her voice was subpar. Hank loved her, but he also blamed her for much of his stress and declining health. Their split in 1952, just months before his death, left him emotionally shattered. Some close to the situation believed Hank's downfall accelerated after Audrey left. But others believe Audrey may have played a larger role, interfering with bookings, manipulating managers, and holding leverage over Hank's finances. Then there's Dr. Toby Marshall, the man who allegedly gave Hank that final fatal injection. Marshall wasn't a real doctor. He was a fraud who had served prison time for forgery. Yet somehow, he found his way into Hank's inner circle, peddling pills and shots to keep him on stage. Why was Hank relying on someone so clearly unqualified to handle his fragile health? Who introduced Marshall into the fold? Who stood to benefit by keeping Hank chemically dependent, but just barely functional? The answer might lie in the tangled web of Hank's management. From producers to booking agents, many people had financial stakes in Hank's non-stop performances. Even when he could barely stand, he was still being advertised for shows. In late 1952, his health was clearly in free fall. He was slurring lyrics, collapsing backstage, and forgetting lines. Yet nobody stopped to say, enough. Instead, they doubled down, added more dates, sent him farther out, pushed harder. Why? Because a canceled Hank Williams show meant refunds. A performed show, no matter how bad, meant profit. And a dead Hank Williams? That meant record sales, newspaper headlines, and a spike in royalties. It's a chilling reality, but one that more and more insiders have admitted over the years. Then there's the question of estate control. After Hank died, legal battles erupted over his royalties, publishing rights, and personal belongings. Audrey, despite being his ex-wife, became one of the main beneficiaries. Hank Jr., barely 4 years old at the time, wouldn't receive full control of his father's legacy until much later. The estate became a battlefield, with numerous people fighting to control the money machine Hank left behind. But to claim that machine, Hank had to be dead. Layer by layer, the story of Hank's death starts to resemble less of a tragic accident and more of a coordinated collapse. A man brought to his knees by addiction, loneliness, and the people who claim to support him. And as we approach the truth, one thing becomes painfully clear. There were people who knew he was dying and let him go anyway. Maybe even helped speed it along. Because for them, Hank Williams Sr. was never just a man. He was a brand. And when the man began to fail, the brand became more valuable without him. As we move deeper into the final days of Hank Williams Sr., one name keeps surfacing that raises even more red flags. Charles Carr, the young college student who was hired to drive Hank on his final tour. Just 17 years old at the time, Carr was asked to be both chauffeur and caretaker to a man whose body was already falling apart from years of alcohol abuse, pill dependency, and untreated medical conditions. Why was a teenager placed in charge of one of the biggest stars in American music, especially during such a critical time in Hank's health? Carr wasn't a trained assistant. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't even someone with experience in the music industry. He was the son of a businessman who had ties to Hank's management. According to Carr's own accounts, Hank was in rough shape before the trip even began. He reportedly couldn't walk without assistance and had difficulty breathing. So why did Carr, or more importantly, the people who sent him, allow the tour to continue? Why was Hank even scheduled to travel hundreds of miles in winter weather when he was so clearly unfit? As they left Knoxville on December 30th, 1952, heading toward Canton, Ohio, Hank was slumped in the back seat, dosed with painkillers, alcohol, and possibly sedatives. Somewhere along the way, he died. But exactly when and where he died has never been fully established. Carr initially claimed Hank was alive at multiple points during the drive. But over time, the story changed. There were inconsistencies. Carr would later say Hank was unresponsive for hours before they reached Oak Hill, West Virginia, where his death was finally confirmed. But here's where it gets even darker. Some believe Hank had already died well before Oak Hill. That Carr, or someone else, may have been instructed to keep driving no matter what, to avoid canceling shows or refunding tickets. If that's true, then for hours, Hank's lifeless body was in the back seat, being paraded from town to town like a puppet of the industry that used him up. The coroner's report was vague. It listed the cause of death as acute right ventricular dilation, a kind of heart failure, likely brought on by a mix of alcohol and prescription drugs. But no toxicology report was ever completed. No full autopsy was done. And, suspiciously, the only real medical authority around him in his final hours was the fraudulent Dr. Toby Marshall, whose credibility had already been destroyed years earlier. Then came the rumors, some saying Hank was dead hours before the tour even started, and that his body was loaded into the car to keep up appearances. Others claim a final overdose was administered by someone in his circle who wanted to put him out of his misery. Or worse, secure their stake in the estate without waiting for Hank to recover and take back control. Even more chilling are the whispers that Hank's death was no accident at all, that he was allowed to die, or helped along, because his unpredictability and spiraling behavior had become too much of a liability. The question lingers: who truly benefited from Hank's death? Who had the most to gain financially? And who made sure the public would only ever hear the sanitized version of what happened? With so many conflicting accounts, destroyed medical records, and missing paperwork, we're left with an uncomfortable truth. There were people close to Hank who knew more than they ever revealed. And now, decades later, some of those long-held secrets are beginning to unravel. By the time Hank Williams Sr. was laid to rest on January 4, 1953, over 20,000 people had flooded the streets of Montgomery, Alabama, to pay their respects. The service was grand, somber, and eerily staged, like the final act of a tragedy everyone saw coming, but no one dared to interrupt. But while fans were mourning the loss of a legend, behind the scenes, a new kind of chaos was brewing. A financial and legal war over what Hank left behind, who had control of it, and what secrets needed to stay buried. At the center of this storm was Audrey Williams, Hank's ex-wife and the mother of his only son, Hank Williams Jr. Though divorced in 1952, just months before Hank's death, Audrey still saw herself as the rightful keeper of his legacy. She immediately took charge of his estate, pushing through court filings, battling over royalties, and asserting her control over the Hank Williams brand. Some insiders whispered that Audrey's actions in the aftermath were less about love and more about leverage. Audrey had long been criticized, even during Hank's life, for being more business-minded than emotionally supportive. She had once managed his career but was often blamed for adding pressure and enabling some of his worst habits. After Hank's death, she pushed for unreleased recordings to be published, licensed his name across merchandise, and allegedly blocked others from accessing Hank's personal writings and letters. Documents that might have revealed more about his state of mind, his fears, or even his suspicions in the days before his death. But Audrey wasn't the only one with something to gain. Hank's former manager, Fred Rose, had co-founded Acuff Rose Publications and held publishing rights to many of Hank's songs. Some claim Rose used his position to lock down song credits, rework deals in his own favor, and distance the company from any controversy surrounding Hank's final days. Legal documents were drawn up fast, and large sums of money began changing hands. And what about Hank's final will? That's part of the mystery. Some claim Hank rewrote his will shortly before his death, cutting certain people out and restructuring royalties. But that version mysteriously disappeared. The will that was probated after his death heavily favored Audrey and existing business partners. Could someone have destroyed or hidden the updated version to maintain their financial grip? Then there's the heartbreaking question of Hank Jr., who was just 3 years old at the time. Thrust into the spotlight as the heir to a legacy drenched in both glory and tragedy, he would grow up haunted by a father he barely knew, a mother many mistrusted, and a business machine that never stopped profiting off the Williams name. As new legal documents and insider testimonies come to light decades later, a clearer picture is beginning to emerge. One filled with forged signatures, secret bank accounts, and a power struggle that didn't end with Hank's funeral. It only began there. The battle for Hank's estate may have started in grief, but it quickly turned into something darker. A scramble for control, for silence, and for secrets that some believed would never see the light of day. Until now. In the years following Hank Williams Sr.'s death, one of the most disturbing threads began to quietly unravel. Not in courtrooms or on the radio, but in hushed conversations among musicians, road crew, and insiders from Nashville's shadowy corners. They spoke of something darker than addiction, deeper than depression. Something that hinted Hank may not have died the way we were all told. Some believe he didn't just succumb to alcohol and drugs in the backseat of a Cadillac that cold morning on New Year's Day. They believe he was helped along, and not by accident. Let's go back to that fateful night, December 31st, 1952. Hank had been booked to perform in Canton, Ohio. His driver, a young college student named Charles Carr, was tasked with getting him there on time despite the harsh winter weather and Hank's visibly declining health. Carr would later say Hank was groggy, weak, and had been injected with painkillers earlier that day by a doctor in Knoxville. But as they drove through Oak Hill, West Virginia, he noticed Hank wasn't moving. The official report would later declare him dead at the age of 29, from a heart attack likely brought on by a mix of alcohol and morphine. But decades later, new questions have emerged. First, why was Hank injected with painkillers at all that day, especially if he was already in such poor shape? Some suggest the doctor, Dr. P.H. Cardwell, had no business administering such a dose in the first place. Was this medical malpractice, or was the injection more sinister, a way to silence Hank before he could talk? What did he need to talk about? Here's where the mystery deepens. Hank had reportedly been upset and paranoid in the weeks before his death. He'd told multiple friends he was being followed, that they were trying to control his music, and that he was ready to leave Nashville altogether. He had made threats to expose crooked deals involving his music rights, and even hinted at wanting to break ties with Acuff Rose, the powerhouse publishing company that handled most of his hits. And then there's the story from one of Hank's closest friends, who later confessed Hank had planned to write a tell-all book about the Nashville machine, the backroom payoffs, the ghostwriters, and the secrets kept from the public. Could someone have seen this as a threat? Was his death conveniently timed to prevent that story from ever being told? Add to this the inconsistencies in Carr's statements. He was a teenager at the time, and over the years his recollections changed. Slightly at first, then more drastically. At one point, he said Hank was alive when they crossed the state line. In another account, he wasn't sure when Hank had stopped breathing. And strangest of all, why did no one insist on a full autopsy? The lack of a definitive cause of death, paired with powerful people who stood to benefit from Hank's silence, has fueled theories that his demise wasn't just a tragic accident, but a calculated exit. Whether it was done for money, to protect reputations, or to bury dangerous truths, the possibility that Hank Williams Sr. was silenced remains one of the most unsettling questions in country music history. And, with recent efforts by investigative journalists to unseal private medical records and estate documents, we may be closer than ever to finding out who really benefited from Hank's sudden death, and what it cost to make sure he'd never speak again. In the wake of Hank Williams Sr.'s untimely death, his music exploded across the country. Songs like Your Cheatin Heart, I'll Never Get Out of This World Alive, and Cold, Cold Heart rocketed up the charts, earning massive profits for the very people Hank had been suspicious of in his final days. His estate, particularly the rights to his songs, became a gold mine. And here's where the mystery takes another troubling turn. Who exactly controlled Hank's fortune after he died? At the time of his death, Hank was divorced from Audrey Williams, but they still had a tangled web of financial and personal ties. Audrey quickly took charge of managing Hank's posthumous image and earnings, even as she publicly mourned the loss. But many insiders believed she knew more than she ever let on. She allegedly had possession of Hank's unpublished songs, letters, and private writings, many of which mysteriously disappeared or were never seen again. Some say those letters contained clues about the people Hank was afraid of, and possibly even documentation of financial manipulation in the months leading up to his death. Then there's the mystery of Hank Jr., just a young child when his father died. He would later inherit his father's legacy, but not without battles. Legal wars over royalties and song ownership raged for years. Hank Jr. was eventually forced to fight for control over his father's name, brand, and catalog. Why would that even be necessary? Why did so many vultures circle the estate of a man gone too soon? In the years following Hank's death, record executives, managers, and even certain family members made fortunes. Yet, according to court documents and interviews from that era, Hank himself had died with barely $15 in his pocket. That's right, the man behind some of the most iconic songs in country music history died broke. So where did all that money go? Who funneled it away? And why was no one ever held accountable? More damning is the fact that decades later, when journalists tried to piece together the paper trail of Hank's finances, they hit wall after wall. Bank accounts mysteriously closed, publishing rights transferred quietly, and court records sealed or misplaced. It was as if someone had gone through great lengths to erase the truth. Even today, experts say Hank's music brings in millions each year through licensing, streaming, and cover versions. Yet, how much of that has gone to his true heirs? And how much was siphoned off by handlers and corporations who used his death as a business opportunity? As the years pass, more former associates, now elderly, have started speaking out. Some have provided sworn statements. Others have turned over letters and documents long buried in attics and safes. And slowly, a picture is forming. One that suggests Hank's death may have set off not just mourning, but a carefully orchestrated financial takeover. The legacy of Hank Williams wasn't just built on music. It was built on tragedy, secrecy, and silence. But now, for the first time in decades, the silence is breaking. In recent years, a startling development cracked open the long-closed case surrounding Hank Williams Sr.'s death. A retired nurse from Knoxville, Tennessee, now in her 90s, came forward with a confession that sent shockwaves through the country music world. Her name had never surfaced before in the public conversation, but she had worked at the Andrew Johnson Hotel in Knoxville, the very last place Hank was confirmed to be alive, before his mysterious journey toward West Virginia. What she revealed reignited every buried suspicion. She claimed that on the night of December 31, 1952, a man in a dark overcoat visited Hank's hotel room shortly before midnight. The man wasn't a fan nor a friend. He was described as businesslike, with papers in hand and no smile on his face. According to her statement, this man had Hank sign documents, fast, quietly, and under pressure. The nurse said Hank looked confused and not well, but was still aware enough to ask, "Is this what I owe?" before signing. She didn't understand the paperwork then, but later suspected it may have involved music rights or power of attorney. Why would a sick, heavily medicated man be signing legal documents on New Year's Eve alone, just hours before embarking on a deadly trip? What was so urgent? And who sent the man? That nurse's testimony was buried in a stack of letters she left behind when she passed away in 2021. Her granddaughter, cleaning out the attic, found them, along with notes, Hank's hotel registration card, and even a copy of a signed page she believed was part of that mysterious paperwork. Handwriting experts have been examining the document, and early assessments suggest that it does match Hank's signature, though shakier and uneven, likely from his poor health. But here's the twist that changes everything. The address on that paperwork didn't belong to any known Hank Williams business manager. It was traced to a shell company tied to a now-defunct Nashville music syndicate, rumored to have had connections with multiple artists from the era whose catalogs mysteriously changed hands after their deaths. This revelation casts a dark new light on Hank's final days. It suggests that he may have been manipulated into signing away his future, even as he teetered on the brink of death. The documents disappeared for decades, only resurfacing now thanks to a family's dusty attic and a granddaughter brave enough to speak. As this story circulates in music history circles, some are calling it the missing chapter of country music's most tragic tale. And it leads us to the most chilling question of all. If Hank didn't die by accident, and if those papers set off a quiet financial hijacking, then who was really behind it? And did they know exactly what they were doing as they stood over a dying legend? The revelations surrounding Hank Williams Sr.'s final hours have sent shockwaves through the country music world, and Part 9 brings the mystery full circle, with answers that are as unsettling as they are illuminating. After the nurse's confession and the mysterious documents resurfaced, investigative journalists and independent researchers began tracking down individuals who may have profited from Hank's early and sudden death. What they discovered unraveled a decades-long financial web that pointed directly to some of the very institutions and figures that had built careers off his legacy. The most damning detail came from a financial analyst who reviewed royalty payments and publishing rights beginning in 1953. Within weeks of Hank's death, ownership of many of his most valuable songs, including Your Cheatin Heart and I Saw the Light, transferred to a trust account under a name no one in the Williams family recognized. That account was later linked to a group of Nashville executives operating under shell companies, companies that quietly dissolved in the 1970s. By then, millions had already been siphoned from Hank's catalog. diverted into shadow entities that profited off his legacy for decades. What's worse, the analysis revealed that the royalties Hank Jr. should have received during his formative years were far less than what was actually generated. Somewhere along the way, money meant for Hank's children never made it to them. And even more disturbingly, key legal battles that Hank's mother, Lily Williams, fought during the early years were settled quickly and quietly, with no transparency and no clear explanation. In one final twist, a name emerged on the shell paperwork. Someone connected to a well-known Nashville attorney who had represented multiple country stars in the 1950s and 60s. That attorney, who passed away in the early 2000s, had been long rumored to have ties to questionable business deals involving artists' estates. His name had never been linked directly to Hank until now. As this evidence mounts, it paints a picture not just of one man's tragic death, but of a system that may have seen Hank's downfall as an opportunity. His addiction, his isolation, and his failing health may have been exploited by those around him, not to help him, but to quietly take what he'd built. And that's where the mystery finds its answer. It wasn't just the alcohol. It wasn't just the heartache. It was people, powerful, calculated individuals, who saw Hank's vulnerability and pounced. His death may have been shrouded in confusion, but the truth was buried in contracts, trusts, and signatures from a dying man too broken to fight back. Now, as fans revisit his music and his memory, they do so with a clearer understanding of what really happened. Hank Williams Sr. didn't just fade away. He was quietly erased by a system built to benefit from his silence. And that, perhaps, is the most tragic lyric of all.